The smell of stale coffee and ozone filled the mobile command unit, a scent Elias Thorne had long associated with controlled chaos. But today, the chaos felt different. It was sharp, personal. Through the reinforced glass, he watched the suburban house, a 2-story beige box that had become the epicenter of a world collapsing. Inside, a man named Marcus Vance was holding his wife and 2 children, and for the last 4 hours, he had refused to speak to anyone but Elias. The sniper's dot, a tiny crimson star, danced over the living room window, a silent promise of an ending Elias was paid to prevent. "He's talking again," a technician said, his voice flat. Elias adjusted the headset, the familiar pressure, a cold comfort. The world narrowed to the sound of Marcus's breathing, shallow and ragged. "Elias, are you still there, you son of a bitch?" The voice was thin, stretched over a wire of panic. Elias kept his own tone low, a practiced balm. "I'm here, Marcus. We're still talking. That's good. Tell me what's happening in there." He pictured the layout from the blueprints, the sofa, where the wife, Sarah, was likely tied, the hallway leading to the children's bedrooms. "What's happening is that the script is wrong," Marcus hissed, and a jolt went through Elias, a flicker of professional irritation mixed with dread. This wasn't the language of a desperate man reaching a breaking point. It was the language of a critic. "You were supposed to talk about my job, about the pressure. You were supposed to offer me a path out, make me feel seen." Elias's blood ran cold. He had been about to do just that. It was page 1, chapter 1 of the Negotiator's playbook. He glanced at the file on the table, the hastily compiled psychological profile. Financial trouble, a recent layoff, marital strain. It was all there. "I can do that, Marcus," Elias said, forcing the calm back into his voice. "We can talk about your job. We can talk about anything you want." A dry, rattling laugh came through the headset. "No, you can't. You can't because you don't even know what this is about. You think this is about a mortgage? About a pink slip? You think you're in control here?" Elias felt the eyes of the tactical team leader on him, a heavy, questioning stare. Something was fundamentally broken in this scenario. He was losing the room, and the room was a man's mind. "Tell me what it's about then," Elias urged, leaning forward, his knuckles white on the console. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. It was a weighted, thinking silence. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. "It's about the lie you tell yourself every night, Elias. The one about the boy in the well, the one you left behind." The command unit vanished. The beige house, the snipers, the worried faces, it all dissolved into a memory coated in mud and shadow. He was 10 years old again, standing at the edge of a collapsed stone, well in the woods behind his father's institution. His friend, Daniel, was at the bottom, his leg twisted at an impossible angle, crying out for help. And Elias had run. He had run not for help, but from the chilling, analytical way his own father, Dr. Aris Thorne, had watched the scene unfold from a distance, a notepad in his hand. No one knew that. No one on Earth. He had buried that memory so deep it had fossilized. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus," Elias stammered, his professional mask cracking. The technician shot him a look of alarm. The tactical leader took a step closer. "Don't you? The great Elias Thorne, the man who talks people off ledges, can't face a little damp earth and a broken promise?" Marcus's voice was no longer thin. It was resonant, powerful, filled with a theatrical cruelty. "You see, that's your problem. You save people from falling, but you never learned how to pull them up. You just talk. You're a ghost at the edge of the pit." A muffled scream came from the house. "Sarah. Marcus, whatever you think you know about me has nothing to do with your family," Elias pleaded, his heart hammering against his ribs. The personal attack was a known tactic, a way to destabilize the negotiator. But this was too precise, too surgical. It wasn't a tactic, it was vivisection. "It has everything to do with them," Marcus roared. "This is a lesson. A demonstration. For you, my family. They're just the teaching aid. He said you were the best. He said you were untouchable. He wanted to see if the savior complex had finally overwritten the cowardice. Who was he?" The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elias felt a wave of nausea. His mind raced, trying to connect impossible dots. His father? No, Aris was a ghost himself. A disgraced academic living in self-imposed exile. A man Elias hadn't spoken to in a decade. It couldn't be him. "Marcus, this is your delusion," Elias said, his voice shaking. "Let me help you." "Help me?" Another laugh, this one broken and genuinely unhinged. "You couldn't even help him. You just ran. And you're running now, aren't you? hiding behind your microphone and your calm, condescending voice. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, a chillingly calm statement. The lesson is over, Elias. Time to see if you learned anything. A sharp, percussive bang echoed through the headset, followed by a woman's final, guttural cry. Then another bang. The sniper's scope feed, displayed on the main monitor, showed a sudden spray of red against the living room window. Chaos erupted in the command unit. Shouts of, "Go! Go! Go!" blasted through the radios as the tactical team stormed the house. Elias ripped the headset off, the silence in his ears even louder than the noise around him. He stared at the monitor, at the crimson smear that was his failure, his inadequacy made manifest. But it was more than that. It was a message, written in blood, delivered directly to the deepest, most secret part of his soul. Marcus Vance hadn't just killed his family. He had detonated a bomb inside Elias Thorne's life, and the shrapnel was a single, terrifying question. Who gave him the fuse? The weeks that followed were a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. Suspension. Internal investigation. Media crucifixion. The phrases were sterile, clinical, failing to capture the hollowing out of his existence. His life, once a meticulously constructed edifice of control and competence, had been reduced to a pile of smoking rubble. His wife, Isabel, moved through their apartment like a stranger, her sympathy curdling into a frustrated resentment he was too numb to address. Her grief for the Vance family was real, but it was tangled with anger at him, at the obsession that was now consuming him. He barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of the well, of Daniel's small, pale face looking up at him, of his father's cold, appraising eyes. He replayed the negotiation 1,000 times, dissecting every word, every pause. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a performance, and he had been the unwilling audience. Marcus wasn't the playwright. He was just an actor. Elias spent his days digging, poring over every detail of Marcus Vance's life. He was a nobody, a mid-level accountant at a failing firm. No history of violence, no severe mental illness on record. He was a blank slate, the perfect vessel for someone else's madness. "You have to stop this, Eli," Isabel said one evening, standing in the doorway of his home office. The room was a disaster zone of case files, newspaper clippings, and printouts of financial records. He had a map of the city on one wall, strings connecting Marcus Vance to a dozen dead ends. "You're not an investigator anymore. You're on leave. You need to let them handle it." He didn't look up from a bank statement he'd acquired through a contact who was already risking his career for him. "They think it's an open and shut case," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Hostage taker, unstable, tragic outcome. They're not looking for a ghost." "Maybe there is no ghost," she exclaimed, her voice tight with a pain he couldn't reach. "Maybe it was just a horrible, senseless tragedy, and the man said a lucky, cruel thing to you. People lash out. They find your weakness." He finally looked at her and saw the exhaustion in her eyes. The fear. She was afraid of him, of the man he was becoming. "It wasn't lucky, Izzy. It was surgical. The well. I never told anyone. Not even you. The only other person who was there." He trailed off, the name a toxic taste in his mouth. "Your father," she finished for him, her expression hardening. "Elias, no. You can't go down that road. He's been out of your life for a reason. Don't let this nightmare drag you back into his." He knew she was right. Eris Thorne was a black hole that had warped his childhood. A man whose entire philosophy was built on the premise that human beings were little more than complex machines to be rewired and reprogrammed. His father's work in psychological architecture had been celebrated before it was condemned. His experiments in behavioral modification deemed unethical, monstrous. Running from that legacy was what had driven Elias into his own field, a desperate attempt to use psychology to heal, not to break. But the pull was irresistible. He found the address online, a secluded home in the mountains, a 2-hour drive from the city. He didn't tell Isabel where he was going. He just left a note saying he needed air. The drive was a pilgrimage into a past he had tried to erase. The winding roads grew narrower, the trees thicker, until he arrived at a modern, severe-looking house, made of glass and dark wood, a structure that seemed to absorb the light around it. He stood at the door for a full 5 minutes before he could bring himself to knock. The man who answered was older, thinner than he remembered, but his eyes were the same. They were a pale, piercing blue, devoid of warmth, filled with an unnerving, analytical intelligence. "Doctor." Eris Thorne looked at his son not with surprise or affection, but with the mild curiosity of a biologist observing a specimen that had unexpectedly returned to its slide. "Elias," he said, his voice smooth, unchanged by the years. "I wondered when you'd arrive. I saw your performance on the news. Crude, but effective. for the public at least. Come in. The house was as cold and sterile as a laboratory. Minimalist furniture, walls lined with books on philosophy, neurology, and chaos theory. There were no photographs, no personal mementos. It was the home of a mind, not a person. Eris poured them both a drink, a dark, pungent scotch, without asking if Elias wanted one. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries," Eris said, settling into a severe leather armchair. "You are here because a man took his family hostage and whispered a secret from your childhood into your ear before executing them. Your perfectly ordered world has been shattered. Your professional identity is in question. And you have come to the one person you despise above all others because you suspect he is the only one who can give you an answer. Is that a fair summary?" Elias felt a surge of the old, familiar rage, the impotent fury of a child being psychologically dissected by his own father. "Did you have anything to do with it?" he asked, his voice tight. Aris took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. He seemed to savor the question, the power it gave him. "Did I, a reclusive academic, orchestrate a complex and violent public tragedy purely to get your attention? It sounds rather theatrical, don't you think? A bit beneath me." His denial was not a denial. It was a taunt. "Marcus Vance," Elias pressed, setting his own untouched glass down. "He mentioned a he said. He wanted to see if the savior complex had finally overwritten the cowardice. That sounds like you, Eris. That sounds exactly like one of your twisted little experiments." Eris smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of his lips. "It does, doesn't it? It has my fingerprints, my theoretical framework. But I can assure you, I didn't train Mr. Vance." He leaned forward slightly, the glint in his eye sharpening. "But that is not the interesting question, is it? The interesting question is, who did? Who would have access to my research, my case studies, and the intimate details of your psychological profile?" It was a classic Eris maneuver, a denial wrapped in a hook, a dismissal that opened a dozen new, terrifying doors. He was claiming innocence while simultaneously confirming the premise. This was an experiment, and it was based on his work. "Your colleagues," Elias said, his mind racing. "The ones from the old program, the Phoenix Initiative." Eris recoiled slightly. The first genuine reaction Elias had seen from him, the name hung in the air between them, an artifact from a buried time. The Phoenix Initiative was Eris's magnum opus, a clandestine, privately funded project aimed at stress testing human resilience. He claimed it was about building better soldiers, more stable leaders. His critics called it psychological torture. The program was shut down, the research supposedly destroyed. "They are all gone," Eris said, his voice losing its playful edge, "dead or disappeared. The funding dried up, the ethics committee descended, and the world decided it wasn't ready for my work." He stared into his glass as if seeing a ghost. "My work was about understanding breakage points, how to find them, how to reinforce them, how to create psychological armor. We could have inoculated humanity against trauma itself, but they called it monstrous." "It was monstrous," Elias shot back. "You broke people to see how they ticked. The boy in the well, Daniel. Was he one of your subjects? Was I?" The question he had never dared to ask was finally out. Eris looked up, his expression unreadable. "Everyone is a subject, Elias. Every interaction is an experiment. You, of all people, should know that. You do it every time you pick up a headset. The difference is, you lie about it. You call it empathy. I call it what it is. Applied behavioral science." He was spinning him in circles, drowning him in philosophy and semantics. Elias stood up, the chair scraping against the polished concrete floor. "I'm not here for a debate. Someone is using your work, your methods, to destroy me. And you know who it is." Eris sighed, a long, weary sound. "Knowing and proving are two very different things. And helping you, that comes with a price. Are you truly prepared to pay it? To become what you have spent your entire life running from?" He stood and walked to a large, steel cabinet in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a key from around his neck and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. He dropped it on the table with a heavy thud. The cover was blank. "This is the original, unpublished research from Phoenix," Eris said. "The real work, not the sanitized version we fed to the committee. It contains the core methodology for psychological deconstruction and reconstruction. Everything one would need to build a Marcus Vance from scratch." He tapped the cover. "If you want to find the man who is hunting you, you will need to learn to think like him. You will need to learn to think like me. Open this book, and you can never go back to being the good little savior. You become a monster to catch a monster. That is the choice." Elias stared at the book. It felt like a cursed object, radiating a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Opening it would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. It would be an admission that his father, in some terrible, fundamental way, had been right all along. But what was the alternative? To live in the dark, waiting for the next lesson, to let the architect of the Vance tragedy remain a ghost? His hand trembled as he reached for it. He could feel Isabel's disappointment, the weight of his own principles, his entire identity, screaming at him to walk away. But the face of Marcus Vance, contorted in a sneer of victory, was burned into his mind. He had to know. He opened the book. The pages were filled with dense, spidery handwriting and complex diagrams of the human psyche, mapping out stress points, fear triggers, and emotional levers with the cold precision of an engineer's blueprint. It was the most brilliant and terrifying thing he had ever seen. He had just shaken hands with the devil, and the devil was his own father. The drive back to the city was a descent into a colder, sharper reality. The book sat on the passenger seat, its blank leather cover seeming to absorb the passing streetlights. It felt heavier than its physical weight, a dense object of forbidden knowledge. Every other driver on the road was no longer just a person, but a collection of potential triggers, unresolved traumas, and predictable behavioral loops. He saw the latent aggression in the man who cut him off, the desperate need for validation in the woman applying makeup in her rearview mirror. His father's work was a virus, and just by opening the cover, he was already infected. When he got home, the apartment felt like a stage set. Isabel was in the kitchen, her back to him, the tension in her shoulders a clear signal. She was waiting for an apology, an explanation for his disappearance. He had none to give, not a real one. "I went for a drive," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "I just needed to clear my head." She turned, her face a mask of worry and frustration. "For 8 hours, Eli. I called you a dozen times. I was about to call the police." He saw the emotional plea in her eyes, the raw need for connection. A week ago, he would have rushed to close the distance between them, to reassure her. Now, a cold, analytical part of his brain, a part that sounded disturbingly like Eris, simply catalogued her response. Asterisk. Fear of abandonment, rooted in early attachment insecurity. Predictable. Asterisk. He hated himself for the thought. He pushed it down. "I'm sorry. I was just driving. I lost track of time." He moved past her, clutching the binder to his chest like a shield. "I need to work on something." He locked himself in the office before she could ask what was in the book. The silence of the room was a relief. He laid the binder on his desk, the lamplight casting long shadows across the page. The first section was titled, Foundational Axioms of Psychological Architecture. It began not with medical jargon, but with philosophy. It argued that personality was not an inherent quality but a fragile construct, a story we tell ourselves, reinforced by the feedback of others. The key to changing a person, Aris had written, was not to attack the person, but to methodically dismantle their story. He read for hours, losing himself in the cold, elegant logic. Aris had mapped the human mind like an enemy territory, identifying its fortifications, its supply lines, its vulnerabilities. He detailed methods for inducing controlled paranoia, for creating false memories, for severing emotional attachments. It was a manual for how to unmake a person, piece by painstaking piece. He found the chapter on vessel preparation. It described the ideal subject for radical reprogramming. Someone with a stable life that had just begun to fracture. A recent job loss. Financial strain. A subtle crack in the facade of their marriage. The profile was a perfect match for Marcus Vance. The architect hadn't chosen Vance at random. He had screened him, selected him, as one might select a specific type of clay for a sculpture. A key technique was called the auditory bridge. It involved feeding a subject specific phrases and pieces of information through indirect means, a conversation overheard in a coffee shop, a news report on the radio, a targeted ad online. These fragments, seemingly random, would later be repeated by the manipulator, creating a powerful, subconscious sense that the manipulator had access to the subject's own private thoughts, that they were profoundly, uniquely understood. It was a violation on a psychic level. Elias felt a wave of sickness. He imagined Marcus Vance, a man in pain, being groomed by a predator who spoke the language of his soul, a language he had been taught to speak. He must have made a sound, because the office door handle jiggled. "Elias, are you okay in there? It's past 2 in the morning." Isabel's voice was soft, laced with a tired concern. "I'm fine," he said, his voice too sharp. "Just working." The lie tasted like ash. He was not working. He was communing with a ghost, absorbing a poison. He looked down at the page and saw a small, handwritten note in the margin, in his father's precise script. It was next to a diagram of cognitive dissonance. The note read, query. Does the subject perceive the introduction of the primary paradox as an attack or a liberation? See case file, LV07. The Gardner Protocol, LV07. The Gardner Protocol. It meant nothing to him, but it was a thread, a loose string on the tapestry of this nightmare. He began to search the rest of the book, his obsession renewed, scanning for other marginalia, other clues his father might have left behind. His search was interrupted by the sound of a key in the lock, his office key. He had forgotten Isabel had a copy. She pushed the door open, her eyes immediately falling on the open binder, on the strange, inhuman diagrams of a mind being torn apart. Her face went pale. She didn't need to read the words to know their origin. The handwriting, the cold, analytical tone, it was all Eris. "What is that?" she whispered, though she already knew. "What have you done?" He didn't try to hide it. There was no point. "It's his research," Elias said, his voice flat. "It's the key to finding who did this. Who created Marcus Vance?" Isabel took a step back, as if the book itself was radioactive. "No," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "You went to him. After everything he did to you, to your life, you went back to him. You let him put his poison back in your head." Her gaze was fixed on him, but she wasn't seeing her husband. She was seeing the shadow of his father, a long, dark shape stretching across the room. "You don't understand, Izzy. This isn't about him. It's about stopping someone who is using his work to kill people. This book, it's the only way." He sounded desperate, even to himself. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Listen to yourself," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're already talking like him. The only way." That was always his excuse for everything. The monstrous things he did were always justified by some greater purpose that only he could understand. She gestured wildly at the book. "That thing is a disease, Elias. He spent your entire childhood trying to remake you into a version of himself, and you finally escaped. Why would you willingly walk back into the cage? Because I'm a coward," he thought. "Because I ran from a boy in a well, and I've been running ever since. Because Marcus Vance was right. This is different," he said, the words feeling weak and hollow. "I am in control." Isabel let out a harsh, broken laugh. "No, you're not. You're holding his Bible, and you're starting to pray. I can see it in your eyes. That coldness, it's him." She took a deep breath, her expression hardening into a painful resolve he had never seen before. "I can't watch you do this. I can't watch you become him. So you have a choice. It's that book, or it's me. You burn it. You walk away from this, you let the real police handle it, and we get you help. Or I'm gone." The ultimatum hung in the air, a final, desperate move in a game he didn't know they were playing. He looked from her tear-streaked face to the book's open pages. One represented everything he loved, a life of warmth and connection. The other represented a terrible, cold truth, but also, perhaps, the only path to justice, to understanding. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a line from the book's introduction. "Sentiment is a tactical liability. It is the anchor that drowns the swimmer." He closed his eyes. "Izzy, please, just give me some time." "No," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "There's no time. The choice is now." When he didn't answer, when he couldn't bring himself to push the book away, her face crumbled. It was the look of a final, irreversible breaking. She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He was alone, utterly. The grief should have been overwhelming, a crushing wave, but it was distant, muted, as if happening to someone else. The cold, analytical part of his brain was already whirring, protecting him, insulating him. Emotional severance is a necessary stage for objective analysis. He looked back at the book. He had made his choice. He worked through the night, fueled by coffee and a grim sense of purpose. He found 2 more references to LV07 and the Gardner Protocol. They were linked to a series of experiments on memory implantation conducted at a decommissioned sanatorium on the outskirts of the city, Crestwood Behavioral Facility. It had been shuttered for 20 years, a rotting monument to a darker era of psychiatric care. It was one of the facilities his father had used for the Phoenix Initiative before it was officially sanctioned. It was a dead end, a place of ghosts. But the architect of his ruin knew he had this book. The clues weren't for the police. They were for him. He was being led. The next morning, after a sleepless night, he found a plain manila envelope slid under his apartment door. There was no stamp, no return address. His heart pounded as he picked it up. Inside was a single photograph, a crisp, recent, high-resolution image. It was of the front gate of the Crestwood Behavioral Facility. The iron bars were rusted, the sign barely legible, the grounds overgrown with weeds. But there, tied to the gate, was a single, fresh white rose, a gardener's calling card. It was a confirmation. An invitation. A taunt. Asterisk. I'm here. I know you have the map. Come and find me. Asterisk. His phone buzzed. It was his former supervisor, Detective Serrano. Elias, he said, his voice weary. Just a courtesy call. We're officially closing the Vance case. The DA is satisfied. It's a tragedy, but it's over. Elias looked at the photograph in his hand. No, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's just beginning. He hung up before Serrano could reply. He had no badge, no authority, and no backup. His wife had left him. His career was in ashes. All he had was a book of poison and a map to a place where monsters were made. For the first time, he wasn't running from the darkness. He was walking directly into it, armed with the devil's own tools, and in a deep, terrifying part of his soul, he felt a flicker of anticipation. He felt a sense of control. He drove to Crestwood that afternoon. The facility was even more imposing in person, a gothic nightmare of crumbling brick and boarded-up windows. It sat on a hill overlooking the city, a forgotten king on a throne of decay. The white rose was still tied to the gate, its petals starting to wilt in the sun. It felt like a deliberate symbol. Beauty, life, left to die on the doorstep of madness. He found a break in the perimeter fence and slipped onto the grounds, the tall, dead grass crunching under his feet. The air was heavy and still. The place felt watched. He made his way to the main building, prying open a rotting piece of plywood that covered a ground floor window. He slipped inside, his flashlight cutting a nervous beam through the gloom. The air was thick with the dust of decades, the smell of mold and forgotten misery. Rotting gurneys lined the hallways. Peeling paint hung from the ceiling like strips of dead skin. His light fell upon faded, childish drawings on a wall in what must have been a common room. Stick figures with smiling faces, living alongside words of despair, scratched into the plaster. Asterisk. They watch us when we sleep. The gardener knows. Asterisk. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just a place. It was a scar. He was looking for an office, and records room, anything that could tell him who LV-07 was. He found a wing marked Advanced Therapeutic Research, the official, sanitized name for his father's work. Most of the rooms were empty, stripped of everything valuable long ago. But one door at the end of the hall was different. It was made of heavy steel, with a small, barred window. A seclusion room. Scrawled on the door, in what looked like dried blood, was a single, sprawling symbol, a circle with a vertical line bisecting the top half. He recognized it instantly from a diagram in the binder. It was the symbol for psychological schism, the point where a personality fractures under pressure. The architect wasn't just leaving him clues. He was teaching him a language. This was a new lesson. He pushed against the heavy steel door, but it was locked fast. Peering through the small, grimy window, he could see the room was bare, except for a single, metal-framed bed and endless, frantic scratch marks covering every inch of the padded walls. It was a cage for a mind that had completely shattered. Frustrated, he turned his attention back to the hallway. He found the administrator's office, its door hanging off one hinge. The room had been ransacked years ago, files and papers strewn across the floor, decomposing into a pulpy brown mulch. But his adversary was meticulous. He wouldn't have brought Elias here for nothing. He began a systematic search, his actions detached and methodical, a skill honed by years of analyzing crime scenes. He wasn't looking for a needle in a haystack. He was looking for the one thing that was out of place. He found it beneath a rusted filing cabinet. A small, square floor tile was slightly askew. Prying it up with the tip of his tire iron, he found a small, recessed compartment beneath. Inside was a single, pristine patient file, sealed in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the damp. The name on the tab read, Asterisk Leopold Vance. Case file, LV-07. Asterisk. His blood turned to ice. Leopold Vance, Marcus Vance's father. Elias sank back on his heels, the moldy air feeling thin, unbreathable. This wasn't a random connection. It was generational. The architect hadn't just groomed Marcus. He had been cultivating the family's trauma for years, perhaps decades. He ripped open the plastic and began to read. Leopold Vance had been a patient at Crestwood 25 years ago, admitted for a severe psychotic break. He was a gardener at the city's botanical gardens, a quiet man who suddenly began claiming his plants were speaking to him, telling him dark secrets about the city's elite. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But the notes in the file told a different story. They were written by a young, ambitious psychiatrist on Eris Thorne's team. The notes detailed a systematic application of the Gardner Protocol. Leopold wasn't just being treated, he was being sculpted. They were using experimental drugs and sessions of auditory bridging to amplify his paranoia, to feed his delusions, to turn him into an informant who could gather information without ever realizing he was being used. They were breaking his mind to turn him into a tool. The file ended abruptly. Leopold had suffered a catastrophic psychological collapse during a session. There was a brief, heavily redacted report on the incident, followed by a final, chilling entry. Asterisk subject terminated. Protocol deemed a partial success. Trauma transference to next of kin to be monitored for longitudinal study. Asterisk. Trauma transference to next of kin. They hadn't just killed him. They had planted a seed of madness in his son, Marcus, a child at the time, and had been watching it grow ever since. This wasn't about revenge against Elias. The Vance family tragedy was the final stage of an experiment that had been running for a quarter of a century, and the architect, the person now orchestrating this endgame, had to be the young, ambitious psychiatrist from the file. But the signature on the notes was illegible, a series of sharp, angry loops, a dead end. A floorboard creaked behind him. Elias spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the tire iron held tight in his hand. Standing in the doorway of the office was a woman. She was in her late 50s, with short, graying hair and eyes that held a weary, haunted intelligence. She wore a simple, dark jacket and held a small, powerful flashlight of her own. Its beam trained on his face, momentarily blinding him. "You found it," she said, her voice calm, without surprise. "I was wondering how long it would take you." "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his own voice tight with adrenaline. She lowered her beam slightly, a gesture of de-escalation. "My name is Dr. Elena Petrova," she said, "and 30 years ago, I was your father's protege. I was one of the lead researchers on the Phoenix Initiative." The name sent a jolt through him. She was one of them. One of the monsters from the book. "And I was the doctor who wrote that file," she added, her voice heavy with a regret that felt ancient and profound. "I killed Leopold Vance." The confession hung in the dusty air. It wasn't boastful or defiant. It was a simple statement of a fact she had clearly lived with for a very long time. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, not lowering the tire iron. "Why are you leading me on this scavenger hunt?" Petrova took a cautious step into the room, her eyes scanning the mess. "I'm not the one leading you," she said. "He is. I'm just trying to get to you first, trying to stop you from becoming the final piece in his grand design." "Who is he?" Elias pressed, his patience gone. "Who is the architect?" Petrova's gaze was direct, filled with a grim certainty. "The most gifted mind your father ever encountered. The only one Eris ever considered his equal, perhaps even his superior. The man who perfected the Gardner Protocol after what happened to Leopold. His name is Julian Croft." The name meant nothing to Elias, but Petrova spoke it with a mixture of awe and terror. "He was the true believer," she continued. "While the rest of us saw Phoenix as a tool, a means to an end, Julian saw it as a new form of evolution. He believed that by systematically breaking a person and rebuilding them, you could create something stronger, purer, a human being free from the liability of sentiment." She was quoting his father's words, the phrase he had used to justify leaving Isabel. A cold dread washed over him. Julian wasn't just using Eris's work, he was living it. "So, Marcus Vance," Elias began, "was his masterpiece," Petrova finished. "The culmination of a lifetime of work. He took the seed of trauma planted in Marcus as a child and cultivated it, nurtured it. For years, he became his friend, his confidant. He guided him into financial ruin, subtly poisoned his marriage, and when Marcus was at his most vulnerable, he activated him. He turned a desperate man into a weapon aimed directly at you." "Why me?" Elias asked, the question that had tormented him for weeks. "What did I ever do to him?" Petrova's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "You have to understand Julian's mindset. To him, your father was a god who abandoned his own creation. Eris shut down Phoenix, disavowed his own work, and retreated from the world. Julian saw this as a profound betrayal. But then there was you, the son, the one who took his father's tools and perverted them, using them for empathy, for healing. In Julian's eyes, you are the ultimate heresy, and this entire spectacle, the Vance tragedy, leaving you the book, leading you here, it's not about killing you. It's about converting you." Elias stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. "He wants to prove that in the end, I'm just like my father, he whispered. He wants to strip away the savior complex and reveal the monster underneath. Petrova nodded grimly. He engineered a crisis so profound that you would have no choice but to turn to your father's methods. He gave you the book because he wants you to learn his language. He wants to force you to become him, so he can finally prove to himself, and to the ghost of your father, that his philosophy was the correct one all along. You are the final experiment, Elias. A wave of nausea and rage washed over him. His life, his career, his marriage, all collateral damage in a philosophical war between two madmen. He was nothing but a pawn on a chessboard he never knew existed. Where is he? Elias growled. I'm going to find him, and I'm going to stop him. Petrova held up a hand. You can't. Not like this. You're playing his game by his rules. The moment you picked up that book, you started to lose. He's already inside your head, Elias. He knows how you think. He's anticipated every move you've made, and he's already a dozen steps ahead. So what do we do? He asked, the we slipping out naturally. In that moment, this strange, haunted woman was the only ally he had in the world. We have to change the game, she said. Julian's entire methodology is based on a single premise, that everyone has a breaking point, and that controlled, psychological pressure is the most efficient way to find it. He is a master of deconstruction, but he has a blind spot. He doesn't believe in rebuilding, not in the true sense. He only knows how to make puppets. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. He believes sentiment is a weakness. We have to prove that it can be a weapon. The idea was so contrary to everything he had just absorbed from his father's book that it felt radical, almost naive. How? Petrova's gaze drifted around the decaying room, at the ghosts of her past sins. He has taken everything from you to isolate you, your job, your reputation, your wife. He wants you alone, armed only with the cold logic of your father. He expects you to come at him as an analyst, a strategist. He doesn't expect you to come at him as a husband, as a son, as a man who regrets leaving a friend at the bottom of a well. The words hit him harder than any physical blow. She was digging into his psyche just as his father had, but for a different purpose. Not to dissect, but to remind. Isabel, Elias said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. What about her? Petrova's face was grim. Julian knows she is your greatest vulnerability. He also knows she is your greatest strength. He has isolated you from her. That was step one. What do you think step two is? The implication was immediate and terrifying. Julian wouldn't just use Isabel as leverage. He would see her as another piece of clay to be molded, another experiment. His phone rang, the sudden noise shattering the stillness of the dead hospital. It was a number he didn't recognize. He looked at Petrova, who simply nodded. Asterisk. He knows you're here. He knows you're with me. Asterisk, Elias answered, his hand shaking. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a calm, articulate voice, smooth as polished glass, spoke to him. Elias Thorne. This is Julian Croft. I trust your education is proceeding on schedule? Doctor. Petrova has always been a sentimentalist, but she makes for an effective, if predictable, teaching aid. I assume she's given you the broad strokes of my thesis. The voice was confident, arrogant, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who was absolutely certain he was in control. Where is she, Julian? Elias demanded, his voice a low growl. Where is my wife? A soft chuckle came down the line. Isabel? She's perfectly safe. For now, she's simply part of the next lesson. A practical application, you might say. Your father's work was always too theoretical. I believe in hands-on learning. Elias could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. He was in the city. He could be anywhere. Let her go, Elias said. This is between you and me. Oh, it is, Julian said smoothly. But she is part of you, isn't she? The part I intend to excise. You see, you have a choice to make, Elias. A very clean, simple choice, presented as a final exam. In my right hand, I have your past. In my left, your future. You can only save one. The line went silent for a moment. Elias held his breath. Doctor, Petrova can give you an address, Julian continued. A warehouse on the south side. You will find Isabel there, unharmed. But there is also another address, a small apartment on the east side. Inside, you will find a young man who has been having a very bad month. He believes his life is over. He believes he is a burden to everyone he loves. He is armed, and he is ready to end his suffering. I know this, because I am the one who convinced him of it. It was another Marcus Vance, a new victim, primed and ready to detonate. You have 1 hour, Julian said, his voice as cold as a morgue slab. You can go to the warehouse and save your wife, a purely sentimental choice. Or you can go to the apartment. Use the skills your father gave you, the skills I have helped you refine, and save a stranger. A logical, professional choice. Save the past, or save the future. Prove to me what you are, Elias. A man, or a function? The clock is ticking. The line went dead. Elias stared at the phone, his mind reeling. It was a perfect trap, an impossible choice designed to break him no matter what he did. Save Isabel, and a man dies, proving he is ruled by sentiment, a failure in Julian's eyes. Save the stranger, and he sacrifices his own wife on the altar of his profession, proving he is the cold, logical monster Julian wants him to be. He looked at Petrova, his face a mask of agony. She already knew. She could see the gears of the trap grinding him between them. There is no right answer, Elias whispered, the weight of the choice crushing him. Petrova looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, unexpected fire. That's the point, she said. He wants you to choose between A and B, so you have to choose C. You have to break the test. The words echoed in the decaying office, a spark of defiance in the face of an impossible choice. But how? Julian held all the cards. He had 2 lives balanced on a knife's edge, and Elias was the only one who could tip the scale. He's watching, Elias said, the realization dawning on him. He'll have eyes on both locations. If I call the police, he'll know. Someone will die. If I try to go to both, I'll be too late for one of them. The time limit, the distance between the locations, he's calculated it all. He was pacing now. A caged animal. The cold logic from his father's book, warring with the raw, screaming panic in his heart. Petrova grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, forcing him to stop, to look at her. Stop thinking like a negotiator, Elias. Stop thinking like your father. Julian's power comes from his control of information. He knows what you know, but he doesn't know what times I times know. Her eyes were intense. He thinks I am just a ghost from his past, a teaching aid. He underestimates me. He always did. He sees me as a failure, the one who broke under the pressure of the Gardner Protocol. He doesn't know that for the last 25 years, I haven't been hiding. I've been hunting. She pulled a worn, battered smartphone from her pocket. It was an older model, clunky and utilitarian. After I left Phoenix, I dedicated my life to tracking the others, the true believers who scattered when the program was shut down. I built a network, quietly, people who were also wronged by Eris Thorne's work, families of other subjects. We've been watching Julian for years. We just never had a way to get close to him. He's a phantom, but now he's stepped out of the shadows. For you, she was typing furiously on the phone. He's given you 2 addresses, the warehouse for Isabel and the apartment for the boy. What he doesn't know is that we have a 3rd address, one we've been watching for months, the place he feels safest, his nest. A surge of adrenaline, sharper than fear, cut through Elias. This was it. Option C. He'll have security, Elias said, his mind shifting from victim to strategist. He'll have surveillance. Petrova nodded, not looking up from her phone. Of course, but his arrogance is his weakness. He is so focused on watching you, on monitoring the 2 points of his test, that he won't expect an attack on his center of operations. He thinks he's the observer. We have to make him the subject. She finished typing and looked up, her face set. I'm sending 2 of my people to the boy's apartment. They're not police. They're a former paramedic and a social worker. They'll de-escalate. They'll get him out, quietly. And Isabel? Elias asked, his voice raw. The thought of her alone in that warehouse was a physical pain. That's your job, Petrova said, her tone leaving no room for argument. You have to go to the warehouse. Julian will be watching. He needs to see you make the sentimental choice. It's the only way to keep him focused on you, to make him believe his experiment is proceeding as planned. You have to walk into his trap willingly. The idea was terrifying. He would be walking in blind, with Julian watching his every move, his every reaction. While you are playing the part he wrote for you, Petrova continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I will be going to the 3rd address. I will be walking into his nerve center. I'm going to unplug him. The plan was audacious, desperate, and completely reliant on the very human element Julian Croft disdained, trust. He had to trust Petrova, a woman he'd met an hour ago, a woman who was complicit in the very science that had destroyed the Vance family. He had to trust her faceless allies. He had to trust that he could play his part convincingly enough to give her the time she needed. He looked at the patient file in his hand, the story of Leopold Vance's destruction. Why are you doing this? He asked. After all this time, why help me? Petrova's gaze fell to the file, and for a moment, The fierce strategist vanished, replaced by a woman burdened by ghosts. "Because I created him," she said softly. "Not Julian, the monster inside him. Your father provided the theory, but I was the one in the room. I was the one who turned the dials. What was done to Leopold Vance, and by extension, to Marcus, that is my sin. Julian is just the final, ugly consequence of it. This isn't about saving you, Elias. It's about me, finally, trying to atone for mine." The raw, painful honesty of her confession was more convincing than any promise. He nodded. "Give me the address." The drive to the warehouse district was a blur of traffic and a racing heart. Petrova had sent the location to his phone. Every red light was an agony. Every slow car a personal torment. The hour Julian had given him was a cruel, psychological vice, tightening with every passing second. He was performing, he knew. He had to assume Julian could hear him, see him. He took his phone and dialed 911, his hands slick with sweat. "I need an ambulance and police. There's a man. He's going to kill himself," he said, giving the address of the young man's apartment. He made his voice sound panicked, torn. He ended the call abruptly. It was a bluff, a piece of theater for Julian's benefit, to make it look like he was trying to do both, trying and failing, to sell the idea that he was breaking under the strain. He arrived at the warehouse with minutes to spare. It was a vast, corrugated steel box in a row of identical structures, a place designed for anonymity. The large roll-up door was slightly ajar, a dark mouth waiting to swallow him. He got out of the car, leaving the door open, the engine running, another prop in his performance of desperation. He slipped through the opening, his heart hammering against his ribs. The interior of the warehouse was cavernous, filled with towering shelves of rotting, forgotten inventory. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling in the center of the space, casting a sickly yellow pool of light. And in the center of that light, tied to a simple wooden chair, was Isabel. She was gagged, her eyes wide with terror. But she was alive. She was unharmed. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He started toward her, but a voice stopped him cold. The same calm, articulate voice from the phone, but this time it came from a series of speakers mounted high on the warehouse walls, surrounding him. A predictable choice, Elias, but an understandable one. The heart wants what it wants. Sentiment, as I've noted, is a powerful, if flawed, motivator. Elias scanned the shadowy corners of the warehouse, but he could see no one. "Show yourself, Julian," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This is over." A dry chuckle echoed around him. "Oh, it's far from over. This is merely the climax of Act 2. You have made your choice. You have saved the queen, but sacrificed a pawn. A young man on the east side has just taken his life, because you chose to follow your heart, instead of your head. A life is on your hands. How does that feel? Does it feel like a victory?" The words were a physical blow. Had Petrova's people failed? Was Julian lying? He had no way of knowing. The uncertainty was part of the torture. "You're a coward, Julian," Elias shouted, moving closer to Isabel, his hands working on the ropes that bound her wrists. Hiding in the shadows, playing God with other people's lives. Isabel was shaking, her eyes pleading with him. As soon as he freed her hands, she tore the gag from her mouth, gasping for air. "Eli, it's a trap," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's not just him." "Of course it isn't," the voice boomed again. "Did you really think I would make it so simple?" Suddenly, a series of powerful floodlights high above them switched on, bathing the entire warehouse in a harsh, sterile glare. Elias blinked, his eyes adjusting, and he saw them. Standing on the catwalks that ran along the upper walls of the warehouse were three figures. They were dressed in dark, tactical gear, holding rifles. They weren't police. They weren't soldiers. They were his, Julian's. And their rifles were all pointed directly at him and Isabel. "You have passed one test, Elias, only to walk into another," Julian's voice continued, a hint of triumphant malice creeping in. "You have proven you are a man of sentiment. Now, you will prove you are a man of sacrifice. Just like your father." Elias froze, his body shielding Isabel. He thought back to the Phoenix Files, to the notes on the final stages of the program. Asterisk. Subject compliance, through inescapable consequence. Asterisk. "What do you want?" Elias asked, his mind racing, trying to find a way out, an angle, anything. There was none. "I want you to see the truth," Julian said. "Your father ran from his own convictions. He built a weapon and then let it rust. He was a coward. I am not. I will see his work to its logical conclusion. And you are the final proof of concept." From a door on the far side of the warehouse, a figure emerged, walking calmly into the light. It was Julian. He was younger than Elias had imagined, perhaps in his late 40s, with a lean, ascetic look. He had sharp features and the same cold, analytical eyes Elias had seen in his father's reflection. He was holding a small, sleek tablet. "Your wife will be allowed to walk out of that door," Julian said, his voice now coming directly from him, no longer needing the speakers. "She is, after all, irrelevant to the final equation, a variable that has served its purpose. But you, Elias, will stay. You will join me. You will help me complete your father's work. You have seen the power of it. You have held the book in your hands. Deep down, you know it is the only thing that makes sense in a chaotic world. You will choose to stay. You will choose logic over sentiment." It wasn't a question. It was a command. He was trying to reprogram him, right here, right now, using the threat of violence and a twisted philosophical argument. "And if I refuse?" Elias asked, his arm tight around Isabel. Julian sighed, a theatrical gesture of disappointment. "Then you force my hand, and my associates up there will be forced to eliminate the variable. A messy, but necessary, outcome. Her death will be your final lesson. The price of your stubborn, sentimental attachment. And in the grief, in the breaking, you will finally be reborn. Just as I was." He was offering him an impossible choice once again. Join him, and Isabel lives, but he becomes a monster. Refuse, and she dies, and the trauma of it will likely make him a monster anyway. Every path led to the same destination, his own damnation. Isabel looked at him, her terror replaced by a strange, fierce calm. She knew. She understood the terrible geometry of the trap. She shook her head slightly, a silent, powerful message. "Don't do it." Elias looked at Julian, at the smug certainty on his face. He saw a man so lost in his own ideology that he couldn't see anything else. He was a zealot. And then he remembered Petrova's words. Asterisk. He believes sentiment is a weakness. We have to prove that it can be a weapon. Asterisk. He looked at the three men on the catwalks, their rifles steady. He looked at the single exit. He looked at Isabel. And he saw a third option. Not a choice between A and B. Not a trick. A sacrifice. The one move Julian, and his cold, logical calculus, would never anticipate. Because it made no sense. It served no purpose. It was an act of pure, irrational, weaponized love. "You're right, Julian," Elias said, his voice steady. "You've won. I've seen the logic. I understand." He took a step away from Isabel, toward Julian, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Let her go. I'll stay." Julian smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile. It was the smile of a god whose creation had finally bent the knee. "Excellent," he said. "A wise decision. I knew you would see the beauty of it." He nodded to Isabel. "You are free to go." Isabel didn't move. "No," she whispered. "Elias, don't. Go, Izzy," Elias said, not looking at her, his eyes locked on Julian. "It's okay. Just go." He took another step forward. Julian was watching him, savoring the moment. The men on the catwalks relaxed slightly, their focus on the surrendering man, not the woman he had just released. That was the moment, the infinitesimal crack in the perfect system. "Julian," Elias said, his voice calm, "there's one more thing my father taught me, a final axiom you seem to have forgotten." "And what's that?" Julian asked, his curiosity piqued. Elias met his gaze. The observer is always part of the experiment. And then he lunged. Not at Julian. He lunged at a heavy, industrial power conduit that ran along the wall, its warning labels long faded. He ripped the damaged covering off with all his strength, exposing the thick, humming cables within. He grabbed them with both hands just as the warehouse lights flickered and died, plunging the world into absolute darkness and the deafening, final roar of 1,000 volts of electricity. The sound was a physical presence, a crack of thunder that seemed to split the world in two, followed by an abrupt, ringing silence. The overpowering stench of ozone and burned wiring filled the air, thick and acrid. In the pitch black, Isabel screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the cavernous space. For a moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing and the soft, terrible thud of Elias's body hitting the concrete floor. Confusion erupted on the catwalks above. Curses were shouted in the disorienting blackness. A single, panicked gunshot went off. The muzzle flashed a brilliant, terrifying strobe that illuminated a frozen tableau of chaos for a fraction of a second. Isabel on her knees, reaching for the space where Elias had been. The three gunmen, weapons half raised, their faces masks of confusion. And Julian Croft, standing alone, his face contorted, not in fear, but in a mask of incandescent, intellectual fury. His perfect experiment, his immaculate stage, had been smashed by a single, brutish, illogical act. "Lights! Get your lights on!" Julian's voice, no longer calm or articulate, was a venomous hiss. He was a god whose temple had just been defiled by a blaspheming mortal. The beams of 3 powerful flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping wildly across the room before they found and centered on Isabel, who was crawling toward the dark shape on the floor. "Stop!" Julian commanded, his own phone's flashlight now a small, sharp beam pinning her in place. "The variable is irrelevant now. Subdue her." But the gunmen were hesitant. Their employer was a man of psychological, not physical, control. The script had been thrown out, the lights were gone, and the quiet, sterile laboratory had become a dangerous, unpredictable space. They were hired for intimidation, not a blind firefight. Julian strode forward, his rage making him reckless. He moved toward Isabel, his intention clear. He had to regain control of his narrative. If Elias had made the ultimate sentimental gesture, Julian would provide the final, logical consequence. He would extinguish the object of that sentiment himself. As his light fell upon Elias's body, he stopped. He saw the scorched hands, the still chest. A flicker of something disappointment, disgust crossed his face. The subject had broken the test by destroying himself. It was an unacceptable, inelegant outcome. "A wasted effort," he muttered, turning his attention back to Isabel. "All this, for nothing." He raised his hand, as if to signal one of the gunmen. It was then that the first siren began to wail in the distance, a low, mournful sound that grew steadily, rapidly, closer. It was joined by another, and then another. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the high, grimy windows of the warehouse, painting the interior in silent, pulsing waves of color. Julian froze. This was not part of his calculation. The police were a crude instrument, a blunt force he had taken meticulous care to avoid. Someone else was moving pieces on the board. "We have to go. Now." One of the gunmen called down from the catwalk, his voice tight with urgency. The other 2 were already moving toward a ladder at the far end of the building. The illusion of control was shattered completely, replaced by the primal instinct to flee. Julian stared at Isabel, who was now weeping over Elias's still form. His face was a warring canvas of fury and cold calculation. He could not be captured. His work was too important. He was on the verge of a new evolution of the human psyche, and he would not let it end in a cage. He gave Isabel one last look, a look that promised this was not over, then turned and melted into the shadows at the back of the warehouse, moving toward a separate, hidden exit. Just as he reached for the door, a figure blocked his path. It was Elena Petrova, her face pale in the strobing emergency lights, a small, ugly revolver held in her steady hands. Behind her, 2 other figures, the paramedic and the social worker from her team, stood ready. "It's over, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of 25 years of regret. Julian stopped, a look of genuine surprise finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Elena," he said, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his lips. "The sentimentalist. I should have known. You were always a loose thread. I was the one who let you spin out of control," she corrected him. "I'm here to tie you off." He took a step toward her, his eyes locking onto hers, his voice dropping into the hypnotic, persuasive cadence he had perfected over a lifetime. "Don't you see, Elena? He proved my point." His sentiment destroyed him. It was a pointless, messy end. "With me, you could have perfected the system. We could have finished Eris's work. We could have saved humanity from itself." He was trying to reprogram her, to find the old levers of ambition and intellectual pride, but she was immune. The woman standing before him was not the ambitious young doctor he had once known. She was the tired, haunted soul from the ruins of Crestwood. "You don't save people by putting them in cages, Julian," she said, her voice weary. "You didn't perfect Eris's work. You became its most pathetic product. You're just a broken little boy, still trying to impress a father who never loved you." The words struck him like a physical blow. His face contorted in a flash of pure, childish rage. In that moment, the master manipulator was gone, and only the wound remained. He lunged, not at her, but for the exit. He was a creature of the mind, and he knew a battle of wills he could not win. He shoved past her, but her team was on him instantly, tackling him to the ground. The fight was brief and ignominious. The great architect of the human mind was subdued on a dirty warehouse floor, cursing the name of a woman he had dismissed as a failure. The paramedics who stormed the warehouse minutes later worked frantically on Elias. They found a pulse, faint and erratic. They saw the devastating exit wounds on his back where the current had blown through him. They loaded him onto a gurney, a mess of paddles, tubes, and shouting, As Isabel followed, her mind a blank slate of shock and grief, she rode in the ambulance, holding a hand that was cold and waxy, its skin blistered and blackened. She watched the rhythmic rise and fall of the bag they used to breathe for him, and she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. She had gotten her husband back from the ghost of his father, only to lose him to an act of love so violent it had torn him apart. The days that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells and the quiet, metronomic beeping of machines. Elias Thorne lay in a medically induced coma in the hospital's burn unit, a ghost suspended between worlds. The doctor spoke in cautious clinical terms: severe electrical trauma, neurological damage, uncertain prognosis. Julian Croft was in custody, his name and a sanitized, watered-down version of his crimes splashed across the news. He was the mastermind behind the Vance tragedy, a charismatic cult leader who manipulated the vulnerable. The media, in its relentless pursuit of a simple narrative, missed the real story. They missed the generational trauma, the philosophical war, the ghost of Eris Thorne that haunted every headline. Petrova visited Isabel once at the hospital. She stood at a respectful distance from the bed, her face etched with a familiar weariness. "The young man in the apartment is safe," she said quietly. "My people got to him before he could do anything." Elias's call to 911 was the distraction that sealed it. Julian heard it and thought his plan was working. He never even checked. A life for a life. Elias's gambit, his act of staged desperation, had worked. He had saved them both. He had broken the test. "What will happen to him?" Isabel asked, her gaze never leaving Elias's bandaged face. "Julian? He'll spend the rest of his life in a hospital for the criminally insane," Petrova said. "He's already started trying to analyze the staff. He thinks it's just a new laboratory." She paused. "As for my part in all this, I've given a full statement. Leopold Vance's case is being reopened. There will be consequences. It's time." She placed a small, simple card on the table beside the bed. "If you ever need anything." She left without another word. A ghost returning to the shadows, her atonement finally, painfully, underway. Isabel sat by Elias's bed day after day. She watched the line on the heart monitor, a fragile, rhythmic representation of a life she refused to let go. She thought about their last conversation, her ultimatum. Asterisk, that book, or me. Asterisk. He had chosen the book. He had walked into the darkness. But he hadn't done it to become his father. He had done it to protect her, to stop the poison from spreading. He hadn't surrendered to the cold logic he'd been taught. He had used his own pain, his own sentiment, his own body, as a weapon against it. He hadn't become the monster. He had sacrificed himself to kill it. Weeks turned into a month. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, as she was reading a novel aloud to him, his fingers twitched, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at his face, at the eyelids that had been still for so long. They fluttered. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. They were cloudy, unfocused. They darted around the unfamiliar white room before they finally settled on her. There was no flash of recognition, no dawning awareness. There was only a quiet, deep-seated confusion. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She took his unburned hand, her tears falling freely now, tears of relief and a new, terrifying uncertainty. "Elias," she whispered. "It's me. It's Isabel. You're safe." He stared at her, his brow furrowed in a monumental effort of recall. He looked at the bandages on his own body, at the tubes and the wires, and then back at her face. And then, a flicker, a glimmer of the man he had been, deep within the wreckage. He squeezed her hand, a movement so faint it was barely perceptible. His lips moved again, and this time, a single, broken word emerged, a question that was also an answer, a final closing of a door on a haunted past. "Daniel?" She leaned closer, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "No, my love," she said, her voice soft and sure. "The boy is safe. You saved him. You can come home now." He closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in something that looked, for the first time in a very long time, like peace. The war was over. The cost had been immeasurable, but the fever had finally broken.